Hey everybody. So this is chapter 29, The Search for Order and Era of Limits, 73 to 80, for modern U.S. history. Now, this particular PowerPoint, I don't have a lot of extra information. It's very basic. Now, I'm going to give you all the information verbally, and the PowerPoint can be used as an outline. So that's how you need to use it this way. It doesn't have a lot of extra information actually typed in to the PowerPoint. An era of limits. Where'd that actually come from? Interesting. Jerry Brown was just governor of California a few years ago, but it was his second time. It was the second time being governor I think he served 2 terms. Well, back in the 70s, he also served 2 terms. In the 70s was just about the entire time period we're looking at here, from about 72 to 82, we had an energy crisis. 70 to 82, we had an energy crisis. And Jerry Brown is actually the one who quoted that or came up with that term, that this was an era of limits. Because we had done so much. In the 50s and 60s, we had achieved so much. I mean, space and the moon, and we had just, we had really seemed to change everything, and we were moving into the future, and then this was like a rubber band effect. We were snapped back and really had to reevaluate. Well, with the energy crisis and the long lines of cars waiting for hours to get gasoline, things like that. So, in pretty much the 70s in general, every major economic indicator was negative. Employment, productivity, growth. We were seeing a recession, depression, in essence, we saw. After 25 years of steady economic growth all through the late 40s, all through the 50s, through the 60s, when it slowed in the 60s, but it was still positive, but it would get leveled out more. And then the 70s, we hit another crash. Again, it's the economic capitalistic cycle. Every 20, 30 years, depression, recession, depression, whatever term you want to use, it happens. It always does. By the 1970s, we were heavily dependent on oil imports from the Persian Gulf, from the Middle East, heavily dependent upon these. American, European countries, we discovered oil in the early 20th century, back before World War I. And then, of course, at the end of World War I, one of the things that occurred is one of the agreements of the Treaty of Versailles was to get much of the oil. Often these are called mandates. I've talked about this before. To get these mandates to, we would go in and we would take care of these Middle Eastern countries in exchange for getting a hold of their oil. Well, between American and European countries that we'd had control for much of the 20th century, when the 1960s and 70s came around, there was a real impetus to give these countries freedom and for us to back off. And because it was often referred to as colonialism, neo-colonialism, we were controlling these countries, which were developed. Most of them were developing, non-industrialized countries that most of their wealth came from oil, things like that. And we did. We backed off. England backed off. France backed off, and most of these Middle Eastern countries became independent. And with that happening, we see oil cartels being formed. We often hear that term referencing drugs, but it's just wide-ranging political organizations, political governmental organizations that were these agreements, often profit-sharing agreements, that existed between industrial companies and industrial production companies and governments. And they were highly profitable for both the oil companies and the governments. And these were pretty much the source of revenue for several Middle Eastern countries. Well, one such group was OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This was formed in 1960, and it was the largest. And as a result, it had, well, since so many other Western countries, so many industrialized countries got their oil from OPEC and the Middle East and other cartels, they had an incredible amount of influence. And one of the things they had to do, the only thing they had to do, to get the world's attention was simply turn off the tap. From 1967 to 1973, we see lots of conflict in the Middle East. Much of this a holdover or as a result of the creation of Israel after World War II. Most Middle Eastern countries, what we would often refer to as Arab countries, which is generally referring to generally Muslim, non-Jewish territories, which is most of the Middle East. Countries like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, they often they chafed at the fact that we created Israel out of Palestine, basically carved out half of Palestine and gave it to the Jewish people, created a whole new country. Well, there was multiple conflicts in the 40s and 50s. Well, here in this time period, 1973, there was a war that's referred to as the Yom Kippur War. On this holiday, Yom Kippur holiday, Egypt and Syria both invaded Israel. Now, Israel won. Israel defeated them, pushed them out. But Israel did it with our assistance, using primarily U.S. and British weapons of war, were able to defend themselves. We also did an airlift. We did airlift into Israel, airlifting supplies, weapons, things like this. Now, OPEC was made up of several Arab countries, and in protest, basically, OPEC cut off their oil supply. They said, you know what? We are protesting the creation of Israel. We're protesting your defense of Israel, your protection of Israel. So forget it. You're not getting oil anymore. And they did this in October of 1973 as basically retaliation. Within just a month or two, we see mile-long lines of gas stations, huge lines of gas stations, people waiting for hours to get gasoline. National speed limit was created of 55 miles an hour. That's where it comes from. Some scientist somewhere decided 55 miles an hour would be an appropriate speed to conserve fuel and conserve gasoline. This was created in the 70s, this national 55 mile an hour speed limit. Sales of the American, primarily Detroit-made, large cars, we call them gas guzzlers. I owned one of those. I actually had one of those when I was young. It was like a freaking tank. It really was. I mean, I could have run into a brick wall and probably just drove away fine. These were like armored cars. I mean, they were solid steel, weighed twice what cars do today, and they weren't bigger. I know they were a little bigger, but that really wasn't the issue. They were just solid steel. They were incredibly heavy, and they used huge V8 engines, and they had half the gas efficiency of cars today. I'm not even talking about electric vehicles. I'm just saying standard gas cars today. The efficiency of these cars made in the 60s and 70s was half of what a regular car is, even not considering electric or hybrid stuff. Sales of these cars dropped dramatically, immediately. I mean, people couldn't get gas, and gas was so expensive. And immediately we see an influx of foreign-made cars. And these cars are smaller, they're half the size, they're half the weight, they're more efficient. Truthfully, they were better in every way. Toyotas, Volkswagens, Datsuns, Nissans, all foreign-made, some European, often Asian-made, Japanese automakers. Yeah. This precipitated a real economic crisis in America between OPEC and, you got to understand, all the factories shut down. All is an exaggeration, but a lot of the factories shut down. Some of the best jobs in America was working for the automobile industry, people making $20-30 an hour back in the 60s. I mean, $20-30 an hour is really good money today. Imagine what it was 50 years ago. It really, the oil, the shutdown in industry, the shutdown in automobile production. How big? 1 out of 6 Americans was involved in the automobile industry in some capacity. In some way, 1 out of 6 Americans were employed by the auto industry, directly or indirectly, from service and repair to all the other parts and glass making and steel making and everything else that went into it. It was a huge hit to our economy. You see right here, we see the U.S. energy consumption chart. So from 1900 to 2000, this chart's a 100-year period. In the beginning, we had fuel wood that was still being used for energy production in America, and coal, of course, was being used. Coal wasn't being used to generate electricity. Coal was being used in factories to run factories, things like that. It wasn't about generating electricity in 1900. Today, coal is pretty much exclusively used for electricity generation. What else did you see on here? Hydroelectric and nuclear was really non-existent. Oil and natural gas was almost non-existent. Look at where it is by 2000. What's our number one energy consumption use? Oil, right up there at the top. Almost 40% of all, oh, actually, it's not a percent. Sorry. That is quadrillion BTUs, British thermal units. And what exactly that is, don't ask me. You can look it up. It's not relevant for right here. So almost 40 quadrillion. There's million, there's billion, there's trillion, and then there's quadrillion. Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah. And so what else is up there in the 20 range is natural gas and coal, which is basically electricity generation, coal plants generating electricity. And nuclear is on the rise. We can see right here, nuclear starts in the 70s. It's ironic, by 1980, we had decided not to build any more nuclear plants by the early 80s. Some were still built after that, though, because they'd already been approved. But even by 1980, we had come to the conclusion nuclear energy wasn't safe. I'm not agreeing with that necessarily. I'm not saying I agree. I'm just, as a country, we had had a couple of scares, and we simply didn't trust it anymore. Another thing that really comes about as a result of this oil use, oil consumption, and the realizing by many people that Earth's resources were actually limited was a new emphasis on environmentalism, conservation, things like that. So America has a long history of conservation efforts, the Natural Resources Council, Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, and lots of others, some of them dating all the way back to the 1800s. It should be interesting then when you see this book published, this Silent Spring. It was published by Rachel Carson. She was a biologist, published in 1962. And she analyzed our impact of pesticides, poisons that we put to kill pests, kill bugs, so our crops and plants and trees, food, etc., will be more healthy and have bigger crop yields. And this one that she focused on was specifically, and she looked at a few, but one specifically was DDT. Now, she looked at it, she studied it, she determined DDT was actually bad for us and was actually poisonous. It's interesting today, further studies of it have looked at it and determined DDT might not nearly have been as bad as we thought it was. The long-term effects of illness that was proposed by Silent Spring and proposed by other biologists, she wasn't alone in this, that there would be long-term effects of disease and cancer, etc. That's never really been shown. And we don't use it anymore. DDT, we stopped using that long ago because they believed it was indeed a carcinogen, something poisonous. There's actually basically no evidence that it actually happened. It's interesting, I'm not a biologist, don't study this. It's just interesting, though. It was a panic. People panicked when they believed that all the food they were eating, all the vegetables they were eating, was covered in some type of poison that was going to give them cancer. So between having our long history of environmentalism in America, having some environmental conservationist presidents, this became an actual real movement, a real legitimate movement, not just a few thousand people part of a club. But this became a national movement. Earth Day, if you've ever heard of that or ever celebrated Earth Day, when I was in college, every year that it came around, there would be tables set up, and there would be exhibits, and there would be talks. Big deal. This was officially established in 1970, established as April 22nd, 1970, as Earth Day, where we were actually supposed to think about the Earth and think about our use, destruction, consumption of natural resources. Environmental Protection Agency. All right. So there was a law passed, the National Environmental Policy Act, passed in 1970. This created the EPA. It created this EPA. What did the EPA do? Today the EPA has broad standing capabilities. They have to approve businesses and building. They have to approve new expansions, new developments. The EPA is, I like the EPA. I think it's really good. I approve of it for whatever that's worth. Some people, though, believe the EPA is far too powerful. The EPA can single-handedly come in, a single inspector can single-handedly and take a $100 million project and basically just say, stop, you're done, this isn't going to go any further. They can overnight say 2,000 people are done working. I mean, they have a lot of power. Because it might be about protecting a water source, protecting groundwater, protecting an endangered species of some sort, a bird or an animal or something. The most basic purpose of the EPA was to require companies to file what are called environmental impact statements, the EISs, environmental impact statements. Pretty much almost any time anything is built now on dirt, built on ground that has not been built on previously, they pretty much always, no matter where you are in the U.S., you have to file an EIP. You have to file one of these things about your project, just to ensure that you're not doing any danger to the environment by putting up a building or building houses, etc. There's several other laws that are passed in around the same time period by Congress. The Clean Air Act, 1970. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, OSHA, creating OSHA, 1970. So every time you get a job and they hand you those manuals, or they say the manuals are over there on the wall, those manuals that no one ever reads, all those manuals are sitting over there. That's OSHA. They're the ones that make sure that you have to have a hard hat in certain places. You wear gloves here. You don't cut yourself on a slicer here. You have to have this sanitized here. You have to make sure if you bend over, you do this. You use a ladder, et cetera, et cetera. OSHA. Water Pollution Act was passed in 72 to help clean up America's water supply. Endangered Species Act, allowing the government to I don't know how best to put it. Basically allowing the government to choose specific animals, creatures, specific species, and label them as endangered. And by that happening, that would free the government up to spend money and resources to try and help keep these animals from going extinct, from becoming endangered or extinct species. Now, Time magazine actually published an article, a whole article, front page article, back in the 70s, thinking that this would actually bring America and the world together. That everybody would find common cause in protecting the environment and protecting America, Mother Nature, et cetera, however you want to put it. And it did not. This actually became, over the last 40, 50 years, one of the most divisive issues in Congress, to where Democrats generally are approving and are pro-environment, endangered species, protecting land, protecting resources, and about climate change and more green policies. And Republicans have generally been against that. Republicans generally believing that a lot of this stuff is hooey. It isn't real. That a lot of these things are not real. While Democrats generally believe it is real. Climate change and using up our resources, etc. It actually has become an incredibly divisive topic in American politics. Time was, I guess, naive, idealistic, hopeful, and yet they were wrong. Didn't exactly work out the way they thought. Guess what? Another issue, which was divisive initially, everyone came to agree upon, only in the negative by the 80s. All right, so nuclear power was seen as an alternative to coal and or oil. Was seen because basically once a nuclear power plant is set up, the amount of nuclear material it takes to run it is actually very small to generate a massive amount of energy. And we have enough nuclear material stockpiled and are able to find and dig up enough nuclear material. I think uranium is primarily, but there's other things they use. There's, I'm not an expert on it. In essence, there was enough nuclear material to run nuclear power plants to power most of America for the next million years. Great! We don't have to worry about oil. We don't have to worry about coal. We're just going to build nuclear power plants, in every region because they put out a lot of power. So we'll just put like one every 50 miles across America. We'll build hundreds of nuclear power plants, and literally our energy needs and crisis, energy worries is over. Well, free electricity, basically. Comparable to the amount of energy that is needed or used in reference to oil or coal. Well, by 1974, we'd already built 42 nuclear power plants. We were on our way. I mean, do you imagine if we were still building at that rate today? There'd be 10,000 nuclear power plants in the U.S., pretty much providing all the energy we could ever want or need forever. Well, environmentalists warned of a few things. One, first of all, the catastrophic ramifications of a nuclear meltdown. And they are actually pretty bad. An actual true nuclear meltdown, well, it did happen in 1987. It happened in Russia, Chernobyl. An entire region was basically rendered uninhabitable. Still is today uninhabitable. Although a few people do live there, squatters and whatnot, it's still technically uninhabitable today. So they warned about that. A real true nuclear meltdown, and oh boy, it could endanger the lives of millions of people, potentially, if it happened outside something major. Also, what about the radioactive waste? Because the waste is, well, for all intents and purposes, it's permanent. It will take millions of years for the nuclear radioactive waste to, be inert, to be non-dangerous. Literally millions of years. So whatever waste we create, and it can't be destroyed. There's no way to get rid of it. I mean, I suppose we could shoot it off into space or something, but literally we can't get rid of it. So the nuclear reactions always has this extra material, and we're just stuck with it. And they worried about all that. What are we going to do with the nuclear material, the nuclear waste products that basically is going to be here forever, and the meltdown, et cetera, et cetera? Well, then it almost happened. 3 Mile Island. There was a movie made about this called The China Syndrome. And this was a sort of a little colloquial term people in the industry used. The idea being that if a nuclear meltdown happened, it would like melt all the way through the planet, all the way to China. It would like melt right. Of course, it's it's not possible, but that was what they were referencing with the China Syndrome. It happened in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in March of '79. We were this close. Multiple fail-safes failed. Multiple redundant systems failed, and we were minutes, hours away from a true nuclear meltdown at that Harrisburg plant. It almost happened. And it was in a highly populated area, Pennsylvania, that's close to Washington. It was, hundreds of thousands of people had to flee their homes. And it was stopped. It didn't happen, but it was really close. That was it. Done. Immediately, Congress, in all of its wisdom, said, no more. We can't allow this to happen. It's too dangerous. Too dangerous. No more permits were ever authorized after that happened. We still built nuclear power plants because there have been several that had already been approved. And they went ahead and built them and finished them. But no more new power plants were ever authorized since. So that was it for our free electricity forever. Now, don't get me wrong. We still use nuclear power. There's still many nuclear power plants that are active in the U.S. although many have shut down and they're just sitting there now because they can't do anything with the stuff. They can't tear down the plant because the interior of the entire plant is irradiated. So they can't. It's going to sit there forever. These plants are going to be there 1,000 years from now, still sitting there. The nuclear material, they do have a place they ship it off in like Utah, Montana, something like that. They have a mountain. They actually have designated a certain mountain that has been hollowed out, and then they've put all this reinforced steel and concrete and all this lead reinforced inside it. And that's where all the nuclear material that has been dumped that we had used, because there's still nuclear power plants running today. Ones that were built, there's still some. Yeah. But even still today, in the last 10, 20 years, it's still, I don't know the exact number today, but a few years ago, just a couple years ago, it was still almost 20% of our U.S. power was provided by nuclear. Yeah. But we'll never see more now. But what I started to say was we still use nuclear power. The government uses nuclear power. We have nuclear-powered ships, nuclear-powered submarines, and we still build those new. So oddly, we're so scared about the meltdowns, but we have no problem building ships and subs that are based on nuclear power. Interesting. Interesting image here, Earthrise. It's gorgeous, isn't it? This is a view of the Earth from the moon. Yeah, I really like it. The idea of our shining blue gem, our planet, which is covered mostly in water. Yeah, I think it's really nice. And then I think I have a second image here. Oh, yeah, another one. Waste produced by a typical family in a year. I have to wonder what it is today, if it's better or worse, because this would have been, back in the 70s. Very interesting. Now, we have landfills in the U.S. today that are a quarter-mile deep. Quarter-mile deep. That's what? Give or take 1,400 feet deep. That's crazy. And much of this stuff is going to be there forever. I mean, plastics, standard plastics produced in the 70s take 3,000 years to fully decay. So a lot of the stuff in these landfills, it's going to be there forever. Long, long past our lifetimes. And I say 70s because plastic we produce today, a lot of plastic produced today is more biodegradable, more designed to break down. Not all of it by any means, but it's better. But yeah, in the 70s, they weren't concerning themselves with making biodegradable plastic. Interesting. All right, economic transformation. I like this term, stagflation, referring to stagnant and inflation at the same time. So a stagnant economy, meaning economy that's not going anywhere, plus inflation, which means higher prices. Stagflation. Another element of this is also unemployment. Higher unemployment rate, stagnant economy, inflation, yeah. You go back to the 50s, and we were the #1 GDP in the world. Yeah, you go back to the 50s, and we were the largest economy, the GDP, which is gross domestic product, in the world. By the late 70s, we were 10th. 10th GDP. We were moving to a service industry. GDP actually requires you to make something. We were moving to a service industry country, to where by 1980, half the jobs in our country were service jobs. You don't actually make anything a service job. If you're a cashier standing in a store, checking people, are you actually making anything? No. You're producing anything? No. You're manufacturing anything? Nope. You are providing a service. If you're in a store, a restaurant, if you're a server, if you're doing haircuts and 1,000 other jobs, you're not actually making or producing anything. So by the end of the 70s, we were the 10th greatest producer in the world, which is, that's really kind of sad if you think about it. We were becoming a service industry country versus a manufacturing production company. Prices rise steadily. Again, it's a stagnant economy, and you have this stagflation. Now, we also see a decline in standard of living for most Americans. Now, we had three presidents in this period. None of them could really fix it. They all tried. They all wanted to, but none of them were really able to do this. All three of them, it just simply got worse and worse and worse. It got worse every year. Never got better. So from 68 to 80, our economy flatlined and then went down. And none of the three were able to stop it or turn it around or change it. It really weren't able to. Nixon had price controls in the 71, like in 71, before he, left office. He instituted price controls across dozens of industries, trying to establish fair prices. He and the government did this, him and his administration. Didn't really happen. Ford had an interesting plan. Ford had the WIN program. Whip inflation now. Really cute. He did that. He expected people to cut waste. He sort of jumped onto the environmental recycling thing and said you need to cut waste, you need to recycle, you need to stop using as much oil, stop driving as much, etc., etc. Do more with less. We're going to whip inflation now. Yeah. Steady decline all through the 70s. Didn't really matter. And we'll talk a little more about Carter than the other president. We'll talk more about him in a little bit. Deindustrialization. That's an interesting term. All right. The single industry, the single manufacturing, what's the word? Well, the single industry that was hit the hardest in the 70s was the steel industry. But as far as manufacturing sector, that's the word I was looking for, it would be automobiles. But of course, automobiles are full of steel. But as far as actual individual industry, it was steel. The automobile industry tanked. The building thing, again, the economy is slumping. People aren't having jobs. So people aren't buying homes. The entire housing market, which also, especially construction of buildings and anything commercial, requires lots of steel. All that sort of just tanks or flatlines. All right. Another problem we had in the mid-70s is our steel became too expensive to manufacture. We actually stopped making steel in cases, even when it was needed, because our processes had not, what's the best word to use there? Our processes had not incorporated new technology properly. We simply hadn't modernized. We modernized in the 50s and 60s a little bit, but by the 70s, we thought we were so well ahead of the world that we simply stopped improving and modernizing our technologies and our steel processes. It became such that countries like China and countries like China and Russia both could actually produce steel there, ship it across the world to us, sell it to us, and they still made profits. Good profits. So they could produce it and transport it around the world, including having to pay tariffs coming into the U.S., and it was still more profitable for them, and they could sell it cheaper in the U.S. than our companies right here could make it and sell it down the street. So in addition to the automobile industry and the whole economy slumping, countries around the world, several other countries around the world, could produce steel and sell it in America cheaper than we could make it right here. And the steel was actually better steel. It was better quality. Yeah, it was tough. Most of our economic transformation in this area really stripped us of our industrial base. After all, service industry, that's not manufacturing anything. So much of our industrial base stopped, the car production stopped. We see places like Detroit and Chicago and Boston with massive regions of these cities. Simply every factory closed, every door closed, broken windows. We actually started calling this region from the Great Lakes, Chicago, Detroit, and then Michigan, all the way over to central Pennsylvania. We actually started calling it the Rust Belt by the late 70s because you had all of these factories that were just sitting empty, just rusting away. Literally thousands of factories and warehouses just empty. No one working there, nothing running, no machines, just rusting. Um, it got really bad. The 70s was a rough period. This is also what we refer to as this deindustrialization. We went from an industrial manufacturing country, as we had been from the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, to a service country, which we are today. We have a lot of manufacturing, yes, but we're really still a service country now, service industry, and we deindustrialized. It should be noted if I didn't say it. I know it should be obvious, but I want to make sure it's clear. When you take all of this deindustrialization, you also put yourself in a situation to where all the communities fail. It's like it creates like ghost towns. All these people worked in these factories. All the factories shut down. The factories and the workers and the money that flowed into the community is what paid for all the other businesses, all the other service businesses, all the other stores and shops and grocery stores and retail. It was all paid for by all the money these workers made in these great places, these great shops. All right, so let's move to number 3. Organized labor in decline. Blue-collar workers, factory workers, they faced unemployment. They lost lots of good-paying jobs. As a result, many of these fell below the middle class. The way to the middle class in the 50s and 60s was blue-collar, industrial manufacturing jobs, union jobs, guaranteed middle class, generally speaking. Ultimately, what these people had to do was go into the service industry, which was lower paying. They had to go into other types of jobs that were lower paying jobs, making far less money, or they were simply unemployed because they had no marketable job skills. If you know how to run a steel plant or a steel factory or a steel making machine, that doesn't qualify you to do lots of other things. It's a very specialized skill set that, unfortunately, doesn't transfer well. Strikes increased, very few results. As a result of these factories going down, many unions were based in different industries and different factories. So the union, organized labor unions, they often declined, memberships declined. In the 1950s, half of all workers were unionized. By 1980, that number was down to about 30%. Now, we do see unions rebound in the 80s. We do see some unionization increase in the 80s and 90s. But for years, we had millions of workers that had good-paying union jobs, didn't have them anymore. Simply didn't exist. Strikes became more common. Labor disputes became more common. 1970 alone, there were over 2.5 million people that striked at different periods of time throughout the 70s. It was a challenging times. Urban crisis revisited. What's that refer to? Well, it's generally referring to urban housing, minority housing primarily, city housing, urban housing, and the associated white flight. The white flight continues. It continues to grow. We continue to see the white populations of middle-class people in urban environments declining, while the numbers of minority, primarily black, poor, increasing. So not only is whites down and blacks up, minorities up, we also see that the overall standard of living and quality of life in many urban areas, Chicago and Detroit, New York, actually decline. Even though the actual population in these urban areas increased. So more people there, but standard of living and quality of life declining, not minimally, but declining significantly. Some cities like Detroit, we see the standard of living cut in half. literally 50%. Standard of living, quality of life cut in half in some cities like that. It's pretty bad. So this had continued in the 60s and continues into the 70s. Pretty much every major city faced economic decline because the core of most cities was industrial manufacturing. I mean, that's what many cities were built around. Yeah, all industrial cities from coast to coast saw these types of declines and these types of hardships. Well, the problem is it's extended beyond that. The economic decline meant that there was less money for tax revenue, less money for property taxes, which meant one of the major sources of revenue for social services, for schools, for building new schools, for fixing schools, comes from tax revenue, property taxes. One of the major sources of revenue for schools is property taxes. And I think, and this is off the top of my head, but I think that is, in some places, that is the number one source of revenue for schools, to actually improve schools, repair schools, to hire quality teachers. It's property taxes. Well, when half of the property is sitting empty, either people have no jobs, they moved out, the factories closed down, social services, education suffers dramatically. And now that all the whites are moving out, minorities moving in, who is it that suffers the most? Who is it that's getting poor education, poor social services, quality of life is dramatically declining? Primarily minorities are the ones that are getting hardest hit by this. It's really rough. New York alone, the city of New York was this close to actually declaring bankruptcy in 1975. The whole city, bankrupt. It came close. It really did. The only way it avoided it was the federal government had to actually come in and give a direct loan to the city of New York and millions of dollars to keep New York from going bankrupt. And we see similar things like this across the country, even on the West Coast. Long Beach was really hard hit here on the West Coast. Long Beach was hit. It wasn't as bad as something like Detroit or something like New York, but it was bad too. So yeah, coast to coast. The suburbs, though, continue to grow dramatically. The major employment in suburbs is service industries. All retail, shopping, restaurants, all service jobs, not actually producing anything. So there was actually an increase and actually a boom in some suburban areas because the people moving into the suburbs were middle-class whites that weren't based on manufacturing. Their income wasn't based on manufacturing. And they moved into these continuing to grow white suburbs while leaving cities. So the white flight continues. The commute between suburb and urban became really commonplace. It just became a standard way of life. If you were middle class white, you very often would be in a situation where you were commuting from the suburb into a city, or you simply stayed and worked in the suburb. This kind of stuff, really, it happens. The organization man that we talked about back in chapter, I don't have it in my notes, but I'm going to say 26. I think it was around 26. The idea of the organization man every single day getting on the train, on his hour commute into town, works inside an office building and drives an hour back. That became less and less. If you lived in the suburbs as white middle class, it became more and more common that you stayed in the suburbs, that you simply tried to avoid going into the urban areas, tried to avoid going into the cities if possible. And what we'll see is people living and working in suburbs, or they will find jobs in other suburbs. So the suburbs themselves become the new centers of city and economic life. And the cities just go precipitously declining. Again, Detroit and Chicago, New York, Long Beach, for instance. The suburbs explode. People try to avoid the urban areas. It really creates a socioeconomic, and just in general economic shift in American society and culture. We're skipping number 5 there. So we have the inflation chart, 1960 to 2000. This is the period we're talking about. From here to here. Look how bad it is. Any inflation over 2% to 3% is considered bad. Sure, you'd love inflation to be zero. It never is. But average inflation that is considered safe and comfortable for a growing economy. Because for an economy to grow, inflation has to be low. It's a cute little quote. It's a little mnemonic thing, and it's a simple fact. Ask any economist. For the economy to grow, inflation has to be low. So economy grows or is steady here in the 60s, where it stays right around 2%. Then it goes up to 3, and then 4, and 5, and 6, and dips down a little bit, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, down to 6. This is bad. We in America today have an inflation rate that's edging up to 3, 4, 5%, and people freaking out. They're losing their minds about it. They're talking about a recession. They're talking about a depression, and we're still in single digits. Imagine what it was in 1980 when inflation was almost 15%. That's bad. That means in the case of about 5 years, a 15% inflation means in 5 years prices double. 6 years prices double. So if a gallon of milk is $2 today, in 5, 6 years it'd be $4. So we're talking about doubling prices twice in a decade. That is not tenable. That is not tenable. That doubling inflation prices once or even once in a decade is not tenable long term. Prices can't double every 10 years. Doubling every 5 years? That's yeah. Society would collapse if that went on for many, many years. Simply not tenable. It's interesting though. It really does. This should also show something else, and it needs to be clear. Who does inflation hurt? Inflation hurts the poor. Inflation hurts the bottom half, the bottom 20, 30, 40% the most. If you're rich, $4 for a gallon of milk is the same as $2. Doesn't mean shit. It just doesn't. Doubling prices doesn't make a difference if you're wealthy. $4 is the same as $2. It really is. But for the poor, $4, $2, and everything, milk is more expensive, baby formula is more expensive, transportation is more expensive, clothes is more expensive, education is more expensive, and the list goes on. Very soon, even a couple of those things can... If you're poor, you live constantly on a line. You're always one step, one paycheck, one bad, weak month away from losing everything. Losing your home, losing your place that you live, losing your apartment. Poor people, and we're not talking about homeless people. Obviously, homeless is a whole other category we're not really discussing. We're simply talking about the working class poor, which is, at this point in time, about 40% of the population. By 1980, about 40% of the population are living in poverty or poverty level. It's one of the worst in our history. I think it's actually the worst going almost back to the Great Depression in the 30s. When you live like that, you're just one bad event away from catastrophe. And doubling prices on all your normal everyday goods, that'll do it. Just increasing the prices from $2 to $2.50 on some item you have to buy regularly every single week, every single month. So inflation really, really hurts the working class, especially those on the lower spectrum, which is, half the population or a third of the population, depending on, time period. So the rich continue to get wealthy and rich. The stock market actually was doing fine. It wasn't booming, but the stock market was fine. So the rich continue to get rich, and the poor, as a result of this inflation, continue to get poor and poorer. Got worse and worse. You see, inflation doesn't actually get down below 2% again until 1998. It's a 30-year period, folks. So from 66 to 1998, we never get back down to 2%. 2% is an inflation level that's usually considered good for a growing economy. 3% tops. Anything above that is a problem. Yeah, it's pretty rough. A population growth and the migration of people. So who had the big population growth? The Southwest, the Sun Belt states, Florida, Texas, California. We actually talked about that back in chapter 26. Growth here, but look at all the ones that were really bad. Some growth in the green areas, a little bit growth in the really light. I don't even see it on here. Like really, like light purple. Yeah, I don't really see that. I guess, is that what that's supposed to be? And then you have the pink, 26, 50%. And then these white areas have population growth, but very little population growth. So it really shows how people are leaving these areas that have low population growth, and they're going to these areas that have really large population growth. Now, there's still growth all around. Again, people continue to have, we're not in a wartime situation. People continue to fall in love and have families and have babies. So there's still growth. But you can see where the growth is majorly. And this does actually still tie into the military-industrial complex, which I'm not going to get into here. But we see military-industrial complex, which is still a thing. People may not be buying cars, but we're still building tanks and planes. We're still worried about conflicts globally and national defense. And we're still, of course, in the middle of the Cold War, and we're still, of course, in a de facto war with the Soviet Union as we had been for decades. Proxy wars around the globe. So, we might not be building cars, but the military-industrial complex is still alive and well and doing well. And those are still some of the good jobs you can get in middle-class manufacturing and industry. Era of limits continued. All right, politics. We're going to discuss that. We do see some interesting political realignments. Again, we're skipping one there. Some interesting political realignments. Watergate, which was a Republican president, Nixon, which was disgraced. He resigned. Still, I believe he's the only president to have ever resigned. I think he's the only one to have actually resigned from office. You might think that might have been a real problem for the Republicans. They recovered from it pretty well. And one of the reasons they actually recovered from it is most Republicans went after Nixon too. Most Republicans came right out and said Nixon was a bad guy, he was corrupt. It's the reason he resigned. He understood from his connections in Washington as being president in his second term that even the Republicans in Congress were against him, mostly. He knew he was in trouble. He knew his political career was over. He actually risked being completely removed from office. He understood that. The Republicans, it was a smart move by the Republicans because they pretty much turned on the president when it became obvious he was a criminal and a crook and corrupt. And they pointed at him and said, you know what? Not everyone did, of course, but a lot of them pointed at him and said, you know what? You are a bad guy. Conservatism continued to stay on the rise. Republicanism continued to stay on the rise. And they sort of saved themselves by turning on their president, which was the right thing to do because he was a bad guy. He was certainly a criminal. Political power seems to really shift in our country to the South and the West. Interesting. Wonder how that would happen when you look at this. Okay. All right. This isn't working well. There we go. No wonder political power shift. Look where the people were going. We see 200% population growth in the South and the West in many of these states. So it's not surprising that we see a power shift move to these states, and what eventually becomes 3 of the 4 most powerful states politically in America: Florida, Texas, and California. The 4th one, of course, being New York. So we see this political realignment. We also see that states that were historically liberal, with very diverse populations, they lose power, they lose authority because labor has generally been liberal and Democrat. Labor concerns, union concerns have generally leaned more left. So these states that have more liberal power, more Democratic power, the Rust Belt, as we're now calling it, most of those were Democratic states in previous elections. In recent previous elections. they were losing power, they were losing population, they were losing money, and the money was shifting to states that had historically, in the last several elections, been Republican-controlled states. So we see some of that shift. Deindustrialization, population decline, and we see states like California, Florida, Texas, Arizona gain a lot of power. In the census, 1980 census, we see South and Western states gain seats in Congress, something like 50 seats. From 1970 to 1980, we see these southern states gain like 50 seats in Congress out of the, what is it, 435 seats, and that's what it is now. I don't know if it was all, I don't know if it was that number back then. So they gained like 50 seats because of the population declines. And so we see the political power really shift to the South and to the West. And it's actually remained that way now. Even today, Texas, Florida, and California are still three of the most politically influential states. If of the four states, Texas, Florida, California, and New York, if three of those states vote for a president and choose a president, that person's president because they have so many votes. Again, you still have to have a few other states go with it, but if you get three of those four, you're president. Because you're going to assume of all the other 46 states, you're going to get at least, a 50 split or a 30 split, 30-70 split. That's all you really need. So the political power is really interesting. 1976, the election, we've got Carter. We've got Jimmy Carter. He was an outsider. He really was. He was not a typical guy. He was a peanut farmer from Georgia. If you ever listen to Carter talk, he's very interesting. He has an incredibly unique, and he is still alive. He has a very unique way of speaking. He was a naval officer. He was a respected man in Georgia. In Washington, he wasn't. Frankly, he wasn't even really known. He was a pretty much an unknown. That's why we say outsider. They made fun of him in the 75 and 76 up to the election. They made fun of him. The Republicans did. He was a Democrat because they looked at it and said, "Who is Carter? We don't even know who he is. How's this guy going to win an election? How's he even going to run?" He did run, and he did win, although it was a close election. He really did. As often happens, when you have economic decline, the blame is always on the party in power. And so the blame was on Ford, the blame was on Nixon. But to be honest and to be fair to them, Nixon and Ford didn't cause this economic decline. They didn't. And I don't know if they could have really done much to stop it because they both tried. They both did some stuff. Carter didn't really do any more than they did, honestly. So, yeah, it's interesting. But as is always the case, whenever there's a problem in America, the blame always falls on the party in power. And the Republicans were the ones in power in the early 70s. So it's not surprising that in 76 we elected a Democrat. People are always looking for the other side of the fence. The other grass is greener on the other side. We're not happy with who we got now. Let's see about someone else. Let's try that. He claimed he would restore morality to the White House. Deeply Christian, deeply religious and Christian man, went to church every single week. He was a pastor or a minister, or he was a deeply religious man. So he said he would bring Christianity and morality back to the White House. That interestingly was that certainly would be appealing to conservatives. I certainly would. He won barely. Again, he won 50% of the vote. So he did not win with a mandate. He got half the people in America who voted for him. It was pretty close. Now, because he was unknown in Washington, I mean, literally people in Congress, a lot of them were like, "Who's Carter? I've never even heard of the guy." He was not anything really well known. He didn't get along with them very well. He didn't have experience. He made a lot of mistakes in Congress. His ability to work with Congress wasn't very good. Not because he was an arrogant or a bad guy. People that have met and known Carter say he's incredible. He's a great guy. He's really a really good, friendly, incredibly caring guy. But he was not a good president. He just wasn't. He didn't have that, and it's hard to really pinpoint what it was, but I mean, he really wasn't, he didn't have a killer instinct. He did not have the instinct of the leader of the free world. He never really had that. The really good, that good grandpa or uncle that you always, every holiday, he's going to send you a Christmas card with $20 in it and, take you go fishing. But leader of the free world, Carter really wasn't that, unfortunately. He didn't really have experience. He didn't really manage the government. He didn't manage economic problems. We had a revolution in Iran. There was people who were captured. There were Americans who were held hostage, the hostage situation. And, you can look all that up if you want more details on that. His presidency was one crisis after another. And the problem with Carter is he never really won any of the crises. He's one of the rare incumbents in America that does not win re-election. He does not. He does not get reelected. He didn't run. If my memory serves me correct, he didn't even run in 1980. He barely won in 76, and he was very unpopular, not because he was a bad guy, but just because he didn't really do the job. So, yeah, I don't believe he even ran in 1980, because I'm sure his advisors told him, you don't stand a chance. Or the Democratic Party just said, forget about it. And that's probably good. He just wasn't a very good president. He had one of the lowest approval ratings ever for a president in modern times. At one point, his approval rating dipped into the 20s. Okay, that's bad. If you assume for the moment half the population is Democrat, eligible voters, and again, it changes, but assuming for a moment half of eligible voters are Democrat, that means if his approval rating's in the 20s, that means that would imply that all Republicans don't like him, and at least half of all Democrats don't like him. Yeah. If the majority of your own party says you're a bad president, yeah. Not trying to beat a dead horse here, but it's just a real shame, because anyone who knew him said he was a great guy. Civil rights in a new era. We do have a few things that do happen here. We primarily focus on civil rights for the 60s, but there are some women's civil rights issues, gay rights, things like that we're going to discuss, and some things happen. All right. Affirmative action. Very controversial. Has been ever since it was implemented and still is today. The idea of affirmative action, which is actually, I think it's now technically illegal. Technically, I think affirmative action has been struck down by the courts. But for 40 years, it was sort of the way we did a lot of things regarding business and education, was with affirmative action. Now, the purpose of affirmative action in its simplest form is to account for the historical disadvantage and the disenfranchisement and the lack of opportunity for minorities, especially in employment and education. So to account for the historically disadvantaged minority groups, and this is primarily blacks, but it applies to any disadvantaged minority groups, because they had gone through pretty much all of American history as having less opportunities in work and education compared to whites. Affirmative action was supposed to reverse that. It was supposed to change that, increase options for employment, create hiring goals, reserving positions in companies for minorities. Literally, if you're hiring 3 new employees, you'd be required to make sure one of those employees is a minority. Required. Doesn't matter about qualifications. You simply have to put a black person in that job, and you have to find the best qualified black person you can, even if there are other better qualified whites. Doesn't matter. You have to do that, and you have to simply fulfill these. They were quotas that most companies had to deal with. And many people thought, okay, let's be honest, many whites thought that this was unfair. It created a disadvantage for qualified whites. The expectation was, especially on the conservative right, white people should have the same opportunity everyone else does. And if the best qualified person for the job, if it's three jobs open and the best qualified are three white guys, then the three white guys should get the jobs. Now, affirmative action becomes standard in employment in America and in educational opportunities for, well, pretty much the next 40 years, next 30 years. Within the last decade, we've seen some significant changes to affirmative action to where it's almost been reversed or eradicated. Because there was a lot of research done over the last few decades to show that, for lack of a better way to put it, there's been no measurable way to say affirmative actions actually was successful. There's been a lot of studies done, and there's been meta-studies done. A meta-study is a study of other studies. So yeah, it's been a highly contentious and debated topic over the last 40 years. 1978, this is interesting. 1978, Alan Bake, who's a white person, he actually sued UC Davis because they rejected him. It was a medical school. He was trying to get into medical school. So he sued University of California, Davis. He believed that he should have been qualified. He believed he should have. UC Davis was required to give 16 of its 100 slots to minorities. Regardless of qualification, the first 84 slots they could give to whoever they wanted based upon qualification, etc. But the last 16 spots were required to be given to minorities. Now, Supreme Court, this went all the way to the Supreme Court, took a couple years, went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court actually ruled in his favor. And they didn't reverse affirmative action this time period. They said affirmative action was still good, but it had to be adjusted to make it more acceptable, to make it more appropriate, to account for highly qualified individuals, even if it didn't fit within the quota system. There were marches, there was protests, there was marches on Washington, both for and against the ideas of affirmative action. It is still a highly contentious and debated topic today, and busing. All right, busing is, again, an incredibly debated and contentious issue. We don't do this anymore. This is not a thing that's done anymore. But in the time period, busing was thought to be also not a solution. None of this is meant to be a solution, but an idea that busing would improve opportunities for minorities. All right, how to do this? This was an effort to desegregate public schools, K through 12 schools. All right. Even though desegregation became the law of the land in the 60s, it needs to be made clear that most southern states that had been actually, for the most part, the slave states in the previous century, they resisted desegregation of schools, public institutions. They really did. Even though they were required by law to desegregate, to no longer require blacks and whites to be separate, to no longer require blacks to sit in certain places or use certain entrances, most southern states wouldn't do it. We still see most of these southern states, Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee and Georgia, simply refusing to desegregate their schools and other institutions. There's a court case known as Milliken versus Bradley, and in this court case, 1974, Supreme Court rules that busing had to remain within a school district, within a particular school district, as there were attempts to basically combine urban and suburban school districts just to enforce desegregation. I'll say it again and then I'll explain it more clearly. So in this ruling in 1974, Milliken versus Bradley, the Supreme Court rules that busing plans, which the idea of busing poor black kids to better white schools in other areas, that's the idea of busing. Basically taking poor blacks in a neighborhood, in a community, in a town, and busing them long distance to a more affluent, better quality white school. That's the idea of busing. Because the school that's close to them is a poor, rundown school. And they're going to send them to the better off white school. The Supreme Court rules that busing could continue It's interesting. Affirmative action, they ruled that the affirmative action could continue, but they had to sort of change it. Busing could continue, but they could no longer force white, suburban, rich schools to take poor, urban black kids. Because this is what some states were doing. Some Congresses were doing this. Taking poor black kids in the city and busing them sometimes 2 hours or more to a wealthy white school in a suburb where there was more money, more resources, better teachers, better facilities, etc. And the Supreme Court ruled that that couldn't be done anymore, or that they couldn't require districts to do that. In other words, what the Supreme Court said is poor black kids in minorities communities could still be bused to better quality schools, but that they had to still be within their same county or their same jurisdiction. They didn't have to. They didn't. There was a limit. They couldn't send them just to find a good school 2 hours away. This was bad for busing because in some cases, in some urban areas, you had to go 2 hours to find a good quality school. If they were only able to go an hour or 30 minutes or an hour, you couldn't find a good quality school within that time frame. So this was a nail in the coffin for busing. However, it needs to be noted that by 1980, most black children attended schools that were both white, that had whites. So by 1980, 15 years after it was required by law, we find that most schools in the South are integrated with black and white students. A lot of resistance to it, but integration does occur. It just takes a couple decades for it to actually work its way through the system. Difficult, but it does happen, slowly but surely. All right, women's movement and gay rights. Women's liberation, women's lib, as it was sometimes referred to. The early 1970s, we saw a rise of women's centers. We see a rise of women-run childcare centers, feminist art. We see a feminist poetry movement. We see lots of things that are supposed to help women have more independence, more freedom, allow them to express themselves creatively, to have more, what we would say, agency in their own life, control over their own life. We see a lot more of that. Now, lots of challenges went through the court system. We still have schools in this time period. By the 1970s, they're still all male. Yale, for instance, Columbia, all male, still didn't admit women. So we have challenges in the Supreme Court to several of these locations, several of these places. They go all through the court system, and they're successful. These schools, by 1980, all these all-male schools are required to admit women, at least in some amount, at least in some number. It's interesting, they actually have some of them basically a quota system, like affirmative action, to where you must make sure 10% of your new students next year are female. Things like that. It does happen. We see increasing numbers of women's studies programs, women's histories programs, things like that. I took courses when I was in graduate school in women's history. I took one as an undergraduate and one as a graduate, women's history courses. So, yeah, we see increasing numbers of that. Study of women's history, a more pressing need for an actual sort of an introspective might be the wrong word. More of a critical analysis of women's roles in our society, which was good for women. It was good. It was opportunities. It allowed women to speak their mind more, to be more, for lack of a better word, free. It was beneficial. It's thought to have been a very good thing. There was a publication of an interesting, I think it was a book, called Our Body, Ourselves, published in the 70s. It inspires a whole focus on women's health. We see a new focus on women's mammograms, women's breast checks. We see a spike in what we would think as OBGYN doctors. From 1970 to 1980, we see almost double the number of female doctors. And I say it differently. Not female doctors, but doctors that treat women. Now you might say, well, was there a double of women population in America? No, it wasn't. It was. I mean, there was an increase in women's population, but was there suddenly twice as many women in the country? No. It's simply we see a more critical view and a more important view of women's health and women's needs. Our country, for the most part, for most of our history, has been just focused on the guys. It's just a fact. The men have been the center of economic life, social life, for most of America's history. I mean, most of the world, really. And we see some of that change. We really do see a greater focus on women's needs, women's issues, women's health, concerns of women's education. By the 70s, the majority of college students are women, a trend that is still in effect today. Still today, the majority of college students, it's close, but still, for the last 40 years, the majority of people in college is women. Still is today. Roe v. Wade. This is interesting. This is particularly important, particularly significant, considering things happening in the court systems as of today. Many activists pursue this, legislative judicial measures to basically gain the right to abortions. At the time of Roe v. Wade, half the states in America, abortion was basically illegal. There was women that had to drive two states to even have a chance of getting an abortion. Roe v. Wade's a court ruling. It struck down the Texas law, which the Texas law made abortion illegal. It's really interesting, ironic, considering what's happening in Texas, right now. But it struck down the Texas law, which made abortion illegal. Now abortions in the first trimester were legal, and we actually see the power of Roe v. Wade expand over the next few years. The courts are seen as moderate to liberal. On most issues, they're coming down more moderate, middle of the road, but also seen as more liberal. And this is a result, honestly, of the fact that we had multiple Democratic presidents in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and by the 70s, the Supreme Court has several Supreme Court members, that were nominated by Democratic presidents. So the court is seen as moderate, left-leaning. Of course, an increasing polarizing issue today. Women having the right to control their own bodies and the right to have control over their own reproduction. An issue that would seem to be completely logical and not up for debate. And yet, of course, it is one of the most hotly debated topics in America today. Gay rights. Interesting. Harvey Milk. 1970s. He was a city supervisor, a city council. He was the first openly gay person in San Francisco to run for city supervisor, city council in San Francisco. He ran, and I think he lost a couple times. Then he finally wins a seat in 77. There's an increasing movement towards gay rights in America in the 70s. Increasing numbers of ordinances, increasing actually code written out that says homosexuality was okay. You should know that even in the 1970s, according to I forget what it's called, the medical journal DSM or something, homosexuality was still categorized all the way up to 1977, I believe. Homosexuality was categorized as mental illness. Hell, today there's still some people who think that way. Still. So, yeah. But we do see increasing ordinances. We do see increasing acceptance of homosexuality in large cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, places like that. We see increasing movements towards gay rights. Again, Milk was the most high-profile politician. High-profile politician, gay as well. He was probably assumed he was going to run for mayor. I don't recall specifically whether he actually ran, but it was probably assumed that he would try to run. Again, if you're on the city council, it's a logical step, if you're popular, to maybe run for mayor. He was assassinated. He was assassinated in 1980, along with the mayor. I think the actual mayor at the time was killed as well. I think Moscone, something like that was his name. So Milk was killed. The mayor, I think, was killed. Yeah. Yeah. So he actually gets a gay rights ordinance passed in San Francisco. And I think most people would say one of the most accepting large cities in the United States today for homosexuality, for gays. They have parades, pride parades, is probably San Francisco. It probably is one of the most accepting places in our country. This next one we will not worry about. Oh, I think I actually did remove it. Never mind. I took it out. All right. Reform and reaction in the 1970s, Supreme Court, and the Rights Revolution. Law and Order in the Warren Court. Earl Warren was appointed by Eisenhower in 1953. He became the Chief Justice. He ran the court from 1954 to 1969. Again, everyone has an equal vote, but the Chief Justice has a lot of sway in what cases the court takes. He has a lot of pull in what cases the court takes, and the Chief Justice is often thought to, in most cases, Chief Justice is seen as the mediator between the liberal and conservative justices. It's often seen that way. Now, many right-wing activists accuse the court of what they call legislating on the bench. Many conservatives, especially during the civil rights movement, 60s and 70s, they really accused the court of legislating from the bench. What that meant was the Supreme Court making law without technically making law, because the court doesn't make law. But by overturning laws, by allowing laws to stay on the books, many conservative people, many people on the right said the court was, in essence, de facto making law, legislating from the bench. Some very interesting rulings. Some key ones. 1966, Miranda versus Arizona. 66, Miranda versus Arizona. You've probably heard of this. Your Miranda rights. Your Miranda rights when you're arrested. The ruling in this was the court said that if you are arrested, you must be informed of your civil and your judicial rights at the time you're arrested. And of course, you have the right to remain silent, which most people don't do. I've watched enough cops to know most people simply can't keep their mouth shut. Yeah. So that was Miranda versus Arizona, 1966. Roth versus the United States, 1957. This was about pornography. Obscene material. The court ruled that obscene material, which was not itself actually defined, which was one of the problems, but obscene material had to have some type of redeeming social importance. To say it differently, the only way obscenity, nudity, pornography, sex clubs, movie theaters, which were all over the cities in this time period, and the pornography industry was just basically being born in the 1970s. If it had any type of socially redeeming value, that's the term usually would hear said in more common vernacular, it was okay. And what you find is, what does pornography and sex do? They pretty much rebrand themselves by the late 70s as health, as marital aids. Sex toys, they would put like, it's a body massager, or porn films were sexual marital aids. Things like this, to give the impression that there was some type of socially redeeming value. Or nudity in sex clubs, they would rebrand it as some type of art or a recreational activity, things like this. And what the court did by leaving the door so widely open that said if anything obscene has any type of socially redeeming value, it cannot be outlawed. This opened the door for what we would simply call pornography. Basically, it opened the door for widespread pornography, which is I have no idea, $1 billion business in the U.S. and probably in the world. It's a massive business worldwide. And today, I'm sure it's been made far, far more widespread considering internet. Internet the way it is today. Critics blamed the courts for rising crime rates, saying that criminality was a result of the courts' leniency towards criminals, towards drugs, towards homosexuality, towards pornography, etc., etc. Statistics don't actually bear that out. Statistics, data, research does not actually bear that out. That there is any measurable increase in crime as a result of laws authorizing pornography or laws authorizing homosexuality or gay rights or women having the right to have an abortion, etc., etc. These are just a few things. There's dozens of rulings that happened in this time period in the 50s and 60s, and then in the 70s as well. Yeah, no. The rising crime rates in the 70s, historians have determined very clearly, has one cause: the poor economy. Very simple. One cause: the declining and the poor economy, high inflation, high prices is the reason for the rising crime rates in the 70s. And they were bad. I mean, you see cities like New York that the murder rate tripled in from 1972 to 1979. The murder rate tripled. It had nothing to do with gay clubs or people going to a sex club. It had to do with the economy, the high unemployment rate, the high inflation, things like that, and probably other reasons too. Now, Nixon promised a more conservative court. From 1969 to 72, he actually appointed several judges, including a new Chief Justice, Warren Burger. Another, it was Earl Warren was the other one. This was Warren Burger, so the Burger Court. Now, what I find interesting is when they put Burger on the court, he was considered a conservative justice. They assumed the court would immediately become conservative. I mean, he appointed several conservative justices. They assumed that with those appointments, that the court would be a conservative right-wing bastion to protect the rights of, conservative Christian whites, they assumed. It didn't. Burger actually remained very consistent with liberal rulings. He, almost every time there was a tie in the court between conservative and liberal, again, court has 9 justices. Ties are common between the conservative and liberal justices. Almost every time there was a tie, Warren Burger sided with the liberals. Pretty much every time. So, yeah. Rulings continue, and yeah, continues to be a very, or at least moderate to liberal court all the way through that time period. Interesting stuff. All right, and then now we're getting closer to the end. Okay, the sexual revolution. Sexual revolution. Changing attitudes towards sex. All right, since the 1920s, we think Americans generally have viewed sex as an important facet of family happiness, of relationship, personal happiness. Sex is good. Sex has often, of course, been associated with procreation, and it's good to have kids. It's good to have big families. Most people believe having more kids was good through the 20th century. Having 3 or 4 or 5 kids. Most people who got together had relationships, had marriages. You were pretty much always planning for a family. And of course, sex and having kids, it's tied. And so since procreation was such an integral part of family life in America, generally it has been seen, why not enjoy it? Why not have fun? Why not be pleasured or have pleasure with a partner? Well, this perspective really continues to grow and flourish in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. There was a guy named Kinsey. There was a series or movie made about this. guy named Kinsey, and he studied sex. He even has an institute, forms an institute, the Kinsey Institute, to study people's sexual practices. And he does this with direct observations at the institute and in people's homes. He and his researchers would go and sit and watch people have sex, every type of sex. He specifically tried to seek out homosexuals, people who had unusual sexual activities, even sex with animals, everything. He basically wanted to have research on every type of potential sexual encounter. Yes, even ones that would have been considered illegal. He got in some trouble doing stuff like that. And he believed that and this is a situation where obscenity applies to no socially redeeming value. He believed that any type of sex, potentially, most types of sex, I would have to say, had redeeming value of some sort. We also know that by the 1960s, sex outside of marriage, let me say it differently, sex before marriage was seen as more socially acceptable. To where having sex before marriage, in a relationship, dating someone you were, in love with, was acceptable. Sure, some people might still frown on it, but it became commonplace. By 1980, half of all married couples had intercourse before marriage. Now, I don't know what the statistic would be in the 1800s. I've never seen data on that, but I'm sure if you go to the 1800s, the number of people that had sex before marriage, it wouldn't surprise me if it was 20% or less. Culturally, it simply was not acceptable. Again, I'm sure people still did it. You didn't go around telling your mom and dad, but it became sort of acceptable to some degree by the 1960s and 70s. Birth control be common. You can now get birth control in every state. Birth control became more common. The counterculture, which is generally referred to associating with rock music and drug use, became more acceptable and more associated with sex as well. 1960s and 70s, the whole make love, not war, love the one you're with, pick a song. Feminism became more standard place. Women's rights, feminism, the stretching of women's opportunities and authority in America increased. By 1965, over 6 million women in America were on the pill. The little pink pill, I think it was. They were on the pill, birth control. Over 6 million women were on the pill. So, yeah. There was still a strong socially, religiously conservative part of America, the other half of America. But for the other half, more freedom, equality, more liberalism, more equality simply extended to their sexual life as well. Have fun. If it doesn't hurt anybody, have fun. Sex and popular culture. Evidence of public discussion of sex, and here I'm just going to list a bunch of things. I'm just going to list a bunch of shows, books, etc. It really gives you an idea of how sex was becoming. It became a topic that was simply okay to talk about. Now, again, not everybody, but generally speaking, it was okay to discuss, not to be graphic, although some were graphic. It simply became more socially acceptable to discuss, talk about sex, and even on TV, even on television. A book, everything you always wanted to know about sex. Human sexual response, the joy of sex. Films, Midnight Cowboy, 1969, about prostitution. Carnal Knowledge, 1971. The movie Shampoo, and then later the play Shampoo. What about TV? Charlie's Angels. All about sexuality and female sexuality. It was really about women's exploitation, to be honest. Although some might have seen it was about women's empowerment. These are 3 women who dressed sexy and then kicked ass. So there's different ways to look at it, I suppose. Three's Company, about a gay guy, supposedly gay guy, living with a couple of women. He wasn't. Again, he wasn't gay. Love Boat about sexuality, Love Boat about relationships, and Love Boat often people had sex. Don't get me wrong, there was no like sex on camera or anything, but they would have, they'd make love or have sex off camera without being married, and it became, for some at least, for at least part of America, simply socially acceptable. Sexuality became more open. Now, what influence did pornography have on this? I've never seen studies on this. I've never seen research on this, but I would imagine it probably had a lot. But 1980s pornography, I do know that I have seen this statistic. It was thought that 1/3 of all homes by 1980 had pornographic movies. Now how they get this data, I can't tell you, but maybe lots of polling, lots of phone calls where they used to do it back then. Pornography probably did contribute to more openness about sexuality for some people, you would guess. Religion in the 70s. The Fourth Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is a religious revival, Christian, Protestant religious revival. Now, Catholicism can sometimes tag along with the Great Awakening, but the Great Awakening is primarily about Protestant Christian revival, trying to bring people back to God, trying to convert people, trying to baptize people, and trying to, in essence, reinvigorate people's interest in Christianity. And this is the fourth Great Awakening in American society. We start with this evangelical resurgence. Emphasis on personal salvation. We see lots of Christians that you'll see bumper stickers in this time period that'll simply say born again. The born again Christian becomes sort of a meme. Before there were memes, it becomes sort of a meme. The born again Christian, and they start saying born again everything. Born again applying to all kinds of different categories and all kinds of different people. It's almost made comic fun of, the idea of this born again Christian. We see an increasing literal interpretation of the Bible, an increasing belief that the Bible is to be taken word for word, that every single thing in the Bible really happened exactly as it was written. Death of Jesus and resurrection of Jesus was seen as a core central theme to Protestant Christianity in American society. That he died for our sins. Now, these are things most people who are Christian are familiar with, but these become really core tenets of the Christian right, the Christian conservative right. The increasing of liberalism and increasing of minority rights in the 60s and 70s, the increasing views of the courts and legal system and Congress, with leaning more towards liberalism, causes a backlash of Christian conservatism, which is really the core of what becomes this Fourth Great Awakening. Reverend Billy Graham, who has been an advisor to no less than 5 presidents, a personal advisor to at least 5 different presidents. Reverend Billy Graham, he'd risen to fame all the way back in the 1950s. 1940s, I think. 1940s, he had a radio show. He had millions of listeners. He had big tent revivals where they basically create these like a circus tent and bring in thousands of people and have mass baptisms, mass revivals, hundreds and thousands of born-again Christians. 1957, he had what might be the most famous. He had a 16-week-long crusade in downtown New York City. I believe he actually set it up in the park, Central Park, or right off of Central Park. It was massive. Ultimately, claiming to have baptized or saved the souls of 100,000 people. Claiming to have baptized or brought back to God, brought to Christianity over 100,000 souls, 100,000 people. Considering how long he did it, That's probably not unreasonable to say, to believe that, considering that he went and did it for so long, him and other ministers. Maybe. This really is what we call the Fourth Great Awakening. The belief in the moral decay of America, in the belief of liberal authority in the courts and the laws, abortion rights, gay rights, women's rights, the increasing belief women's role should just be in the home as wife and mother. They shouldn't be exercising their political rights. They shouldn't. The fact that it became common knowledge by the 1970s that the majority of college students were now female. This, of course, did not sit well with the conservative right, which thought women should be barefoot and pregnant. And that's not an exaggeration. This was a common theme of Christianity, that the woman's place was at her husband's side and nurturing her children, not out working, having a job, having a career, being independent, or getting an education. Not a woman's thing to do. Again, literal interpretation of the Bible. Literal interpretation of the Bible, what's a woman's role? Mother and wife, and to obey her husband at all times. So, all the different things happening, it basically scared the hell out of, however you want to put it, it scared the hell out of Christian right conservatives. Homosexuality, increasing divorce rate too. It should be noted the divorce rate had gone up like 10 points in the last decade. So increasing divorce rate was thought as problem. Pornography, of course, pornography is seen as a terrible sin for Christians. We see church membership grow dramatically in this time period. Every Great Awakening does this. We always see church membership grow by 10 or 20%. We see the number of church members in America grow significantly in any Great Awakening every time it happens. Another thing which comes out of this is televangelists. Evangelical is basically those that evangelize. They go out and spread the word. They go out and preach and talk to people and spread the knowledge, the gospels, spread the good words, as you would say. And so this is aggressive Christianity, not sitting back and simply going to church every Sunday and taking care of your own. This is actually going out and purposefully hunting and searching people out to bring them to God, to Christianize them, to bring them back into the fold, to give adult baptisms, to have them, have their born again Christian. It's aggressive outreach, Christian outreach. And don't take aggressive wrong. It's not physical. It's not hurting anyone, but it is going out and finding the people, not waiting for them to walk in the door of the church. It's going out and getting them and bringing them into the church. We also have media empires focused on Christian broadcasting. And of course, you can call in and have all your sins forgiven on national television as soon as you send us $20. Religion and family. Evangelists focused on the nuclear family. The nuclear family was seen as fundamental to American society. The nuclear family, again, we're not talking about nuclear power or bombs. It's a husband, a wife, and then the children. It is the nuclear family of a mom, dad, and the kids. Of course, straight, heterosexual, and sure, it didn't necessarily mean white, but if you watch the church services on TV, if you watch all the televised church services, you know what? And I grew up in this time period. I watched some of this stuff. I grew up in the Bible Belt. They were all white. At least in Texas, where I was from, the church services, the stuff on TV, all white. Just saying. They believe that the fundamental unit of society was this a nuclear unit with, very important, a male-led home, a male heterosexual-led home, to where the wife and the children were obedient to the father and the husband. Helen Andelin, Andelin, Helen Andelin, she wrote a book called Fascinating Womanhood. Her Fascinating Womanhood was about, and I believe I'm getting this right, I believe I'm correct on this. I'm doing this by memory, if I remember. was about a woman's fascinating life as a wife and a mother and all of the wonderful things she could do as basically a stay-at-home mom and housewife. It was, to her and to the Christian right and to evangelists, the number one goal of a woman was to take care of her husband, take care of her kids, take care of the home. That is where she could reach her highest potential and serve God the most. Could also help the church. If you did work outside of home, it would be to help the church, assist the church, Sunday school or something, stuff like that. Actually spawns workshops all across the country to where people would get together and have seminars and go to conference rooms and pay money to be taught how to be basically deferential and submissive to their husband and a good mother to their kids. Taught classes on how to be a housewife and a mom. Interesting stuff. 60s and 70s was quite a tumultuous, changing time in American history. It was different. It really was nothing quite like the 1970s in American culture. Wait, until the 1980s, there was nothing like the 1980s. Every decade is new and unique and whatnot. Anyway, that ends our chapter. I appreciate if you actually came through and are still listening to this and went all the way through it. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I hope you learned something. Take care and see you next time.